Now, before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and also pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. Now, David, as our audience were coming in today through the foyer and sitting here in the auditorium, they were listening to some of your beautiful sound recordings. Can you tell us where you made those recordings?
Absolutely. The recording here in the auditorium, as you were waiting for things to begin, and it was playing while Veronica was reading, was from the very top of a tree in the Amazon rainforest, a sabo tree. It's a mix of different dawn recordings. So the sun is coming up. I've climbed up to the very top of the tree. These are big emergent trees that tower over all of the others. The tree has got hundreds of bird species living in and around it. And we hear the great vitality of life, not just as an idea, but as an embodied experience, as a sensory sensory experience in our own heads. That wired directly into our intellect and our emotions. So in here we were at the center of world biodiversity. So this particular point in the Amazon rainforest is the place that, as far as we know now, it has the most species per hectare of anywhere in the world. So we were hearing an acoustic expression of that great diversity. In the atrium, there were sounds from a temperate forest, mostly North American forests, different strands of acoustic experience that I recorded. Woodland birds, the frogs, the insects, all taking the solar energy that the trees captured, that then gets transferred to the animal bodies as they chew on the leaves and they eat one another, and then is released back as acoustic energy. So the sound of the forest is a distillation of sunlight, that the biosphere has taken sunlight, has done marvelous things with it, has diversified it into beautiful forms, endless forms most beautiful, as Darwin said. And we receive that as sound. Now, if we could walk through the forest and smell the different leaves and the soil, we'd have a different sensory experience, but sound is one that we can bring and share in a space like this. So the various tracks there included familiar things like birds and insects, but also the sounds, the little clackety sounds within the wood, putting special microphones on the wood so that when the wind blows in the leaves, the tremors that our ears can't detect but run through the entire tree stimulate that microphone, and I can then play that back. Or the little insects that are inside the wood, chewing away on the wood, and these are carpenter bees and other insects that make their living by eating wood. We hear the sounds of their mandibles on the wood fibers themselves. And so the multiplicity, the diversity of the forest is manifest in many ways to our ears, and I've tried to capture some of those and share them.
And how do you do that? How do you make these sound recordings?
So some of them through just normal microphones, get some good microphones and recording equipment, and then get yourself to the top of a rainforest tree at dawn. That's the hard part.
I'm
the
sure
microphone
it is.
is easy to come by. And it's also great honor and privilege to be able to be with some of these trees. Most of my practice is, in fact, not using equipment, but just sitting and listening with my unaided senses in a notebook and in conversation with people, and I would say with the other beings of the forest to try and understand the story of each place. But I also use some other technological tricks, little accelerometers that you can stick onto the surface of a tree. And those accelerometers act as sensitive microphones so that, say, on a city street here in Brisbane, if you put one of these onto a fig tree that's growing next to a highway, every time a truck goes past, there's a slight tremor that comes up through the tree, through the ground roots, and up into the trunk. The tree is feeling that within and responding. It actually grows slightly thicker wood. We don't hear it, but with this microphone, you can pick that up and then put it into the computer and transfer it into a form audible to human ears. So many of the sounds of the world lie outside of our range of hearing, or they're below the ocean, the sounds of the whales and dolphins and fish and shrimp and so on. But the fact that we can't detect them makes them no less real, of course. And so I've tried to use sound recording as a way of expanding human imagination into different parts of the living earth.
Well, you've certainly achieved that. It's beautiful recordings. Now, obviously you're a biologist, but it's still an unusual thing to listen to trees. What have been the wide variety of reactions you've had from people when you tell them that's what you do, you listen to trees?
Well, the most unusual reaction was coming into one of the trees that I studied, and just to explain to people, my practice has been for this last book, The Sounds of Trees, to visit a dozen trees in some different parts of the world and return again and again to this tree, one individual tree in each place, and sit and literally listen to the tree, but also listen to the people whose lives are closely connected with the tree, and listen to the other forest creatures to try and understand the story of the place through this particular tree. So I was coming into Canada to go visit a tree in the boreal forest there, spruce tree, and it turns out that when you're talking to the immigration and customs officials saying that you're coming to listen to trees is not a convincing story. No. So that was a long conversation, and the next time I went, I said, I've come to go hiking and do some tourism.
Right. So you don't put that down as your occupation, tree listener?
That has generally not been a good strategy. So, but in general, first people think, well, that's a little strange, but in fact, most of us have an experience of the sonic lives and characters of trees. Think of some radically different, like a she oak and a fig tree. When the wind blows or the rain is falling into the leaves of those very different types of trees, they sound quite different. And the tree is also, depending on whether it's flowering or fruiting, there are different animals in the tree, so that's part of the voice of the community that is that tree as well. And so, although it seems like an odd practice, it's actually something that many of us have had an experience of, even if it's not a particularly conscious one, that it makes sense. My dream would be that there could be some CDs or MP3s, websites that help us identify ears by tree, the same way, say, that bird watchers can tell all the different species of bird by their song. Every tree has a song, too. What would it be to be able to distinguish the different species of fig or the different Banksias and so on in this community here by ear? I think we'd learn. It would be, of course, a delightful experience for the senses, but more than that, each one of those sounds has a story behind it, and that story teaches us about our place and how we might live in relation to these other trees.
Now, while you've been here visiting us in Brisbane, you've also done a bit of a tour of our trees. Are they different from trees around the world?
Absolutely. The Australian flora and fauna, for biologists, are famous for being so unique and so different, for a continent that has had its own evolutionary trajectory for tens, if we go back to Gondwanaland, for hundreds of millions of years. And the soils here are very nutrient poor, and fire is a very important factor. So the plants have evolved into very different forms than the plants, say, of the Amazon rainforest or of the northern forests of Colorado or of Canada or the temperate forests of North America. So there's the most obvious manifestation of that is the bird sounds, which are very different. And Australian author Tim Lowe has written a wonderful book explaining how Australian bird sounds have come to be so different and unique. But the same is true for many other parts of the ecosystem here. And the trees themselves are uniquely adapted to belonging here in this continent, the same way that trees in South America, of course, are adapted to their own environment. But because this continent has its own history and its own particular geography and physiology and patterns of rainfall, the trees themselves, in all of their sensory manifestations, sound is one of it, their aromas, the architecture of the trees, very different. There are some parallels with other parts of the world too, of course, but what is most striking to a visitor from another continent is what a remarkably diverse place Australia is, and how that diversity really manifests the particular story of this place.
And is there a particular tree you've been struck by?
Well, it depends. I mean, right here outside on South Bank, the fig trees with the fruit bats in them, and in fact, here is one of these leaves I brought as a little reminder, a native species. We may talk about this leaf in a little bit. Really extraordinary figs, of course, very important hubs of animal life. But My partner and I were in Lamington National Park a few days ago on some of the tracks that have not burned. Of course, the tragedy in the last few weeks is that despite the season, parts of the rainforest burned in the southern parts of the park, but some parts are still accessible. And the Antarctic beaches that grow up on the high mountain ridges there just utterly blew me away. These are trees that have a very deep evolutionary history. They're unique to this continent. In fact, they only really grow in one part of Queensland and some parts of New South Wales. Right. So they have a deep and their own evolutionary story that is separate from the story of many other trees around the world. But the individual trees themselves in the present moment, regardless of that deep history, are very, very old, hundreds of years old, and they're covered in moss. And one branch or trunk will fall and another will sprout up and replace it. So the tree itself is potentially thousands of years old, and you really feel that sense of deep history with them. And you feel their ecological importance as well, because they create their own rain. It hadn't rained, and yet the clouds had been blowing through the tree canopy. And of course, clouds are made out of water droplets, and those water droplets adhered to the massive numbers of leaves in these Antarctic beaches and then fell to the ground. So the tree is generating its own rainfall, just as forests worldwide also generate rainfall on a continental scale. Right. So these trees, that they're so massive that the individual tree is a microcosm of what an entire forest does for us. So one could learn multiple lifetimes of wisdom just from sitting with one of those trees. And perhaps in my next reincarnation, that's what I'll do. Okay, I'm going to sit with one of these beaches. They're, of course, vulnerable to climate change because they're living at a place where they depend on a certain amount of coolness and moisture. And if things warm up and dry out anymore, their particular ecological niche has a potential to disappear. That's not a story that's unique to them, but it's unique to this region, a species that seems particularly vulnerable to some more extreme projections of climate change.
Now, most of us in this room would walk past trees in our city every day. Moreton Bay fig trees, we know very well. Why is it that you can hear things that we can't hear?
Well, I think we all do hear them. It's a question of where we're placing our attention. And certainly there are lots of times in the city when I've been hurrying to appointment and so on, walking past the trees and have no conscious connection whatsoever. But what I've done that's a little different is take on a practice of turning my curiosity and my attention very deliberately to trees, to ask of them, what is your story? What do I need to understand from you? And what, as a writer, might I then convey to others? And my method has been partly based on repeated visits to these trees without an agenda other than I'm going to listen. And of course, we all bring preconceptions to a particular place. One of the trees was in East Jerusalem, right on the Green Line. That's been a source of conflict for many decades now. And this particular place has been in the news. I've seen the tree on the news headlines and so on because a lot of protests and violence have taken place right there. So of course I arrive with all sorts of preconceptions. But then through sitting for days and then over weeks with this particular tree, came to realize, yes, that stuff that's in the news is part of the story here, but there are also other layers of story around here about the culture of people that are living close to the tree who never make it into the nupapers, and the cultures that came before that are present literally under the tree's roots, because Jerusalem is a city that's built layer upon layer. One civilization replaces the other and builds on the ruins of the previous city. And if you can crawl down into those ruins and see the Roman roads and so on, a few flights of stairs below the tree. So that's one example of the practice of repeated attention revealing stories that I had not expected from at the get-go. But I do think this is a practice that's available to all of us, not necessarily through trees, but through attention to particular places, to sort of let go of the idea of controlling the storyline or of knowing what this place is about, but instead over an extended period, asking of the spot that we're befriending, asking what might there be here for me to know and understand, and then to convey to other people, either in a formal way, so writing a book, but also informally, just sharing it with friends around the dinner table or putting it on social media if we're there, getting the stories of the living earth back into the human community. Because our community is so inwardly turned. Most of our attention is focused on our own species, as it should be. It's good that we're concerned with questions of justice and rightness and so on within our own communities. But we also need to listen out beyond into what philosopher David Abram calls the more than human world, the world that contains us and sustains us, gave birth to us, but comprises many other voices, many other living beings I think it would be a provident thing to pay attention to some of those sounds.
Very important. Well, it takes me to the next question I want to talk to you about. You talk about that even in the city, we're not separate from nature. We're actually connected to nature. And you talk about the ethic that we need to explore more is the ethic of belonging. Mm-hmm. Can you describe this greater network of belonging that you believe we're part of? Is it anything like Instagram?
Well, so why is Instagram, I'll come to trees in a minute, but so why is Instagram and these social media sites such an attractive place for us to spend our time? And why can we be then so readily manipulated by the people who've written these algorithms to keep us on the social networks? Well, we're a very social species. What have humans been doing since the get-go, even before we were human beings, the pre-human ancestors that eventually evolved into humans? We've been gathering together around campfires and listening to one another's stories. And in this world now where we're fueled by coal and oil, and that our families and friends are often dispersed over hundreds of miles, maybe thousands, tens of thousands of miles away from one another, these social networks allow us to be in that conversation that is part of who we are. A completely socially isolated human being quickly withers and dies. And social media then allows us to maintain those connections. And I think some of that is wonderful and healthy because they're run through corporations that do not have our best interests in mind. There's also an unhealthy aspect to that where, say, Facebook algorithms and ads can then turn people away from where our attention might otherwise be resting into things that really are not helpful for us. So belonging in an ecological sense, I think, is true at many levels. And I mean, we could use this tree leaf as an example of that. I mean, I called it a fig leaf, but in fact, that's a lie. What I'm seeing are the green of little ancient bacteria that are living inside the plant cells. So a plant cell is comprised of a fusion of multiple different beings into one. And the leaf itself inside here is full of fungi and bacteria, dozens of species of fungi, hundreds of species of bacteria, without which the leaf could not function. It couldn't protect itself from drought. It couldn't resist parasites and predators and so on. So the life of the leaf emerges from a community network, interactions. When those interactions end, the leaf dies. And so there's a microbiological level at which belonging means being in the community that comprises what we regard as the self. But the self isn't an atom, it's not an individual, it's a living community. And that's the great lie that's been foisted on us by 150 years of biology and economics and some parts of philosophy and religious traditions, that the fundamental unit of life is the atom, is separation, is the individual. And of course, those ways of thinking about the world are very powerful and important in many ways. But at least from a biological perspective, the individual is just a temporary manifestation of the real stuff of life, which is interconnection and relationship and community. So the leaf is one temporary aggregation. My body, your body, the body of everybody in this room is also a temporary aggregation of dozens of bacterial cells, fungal cells, and human cells working together to produce the human body and the human mind. Even in that place where we imagine ourselves to be most alone, human consciousness, the subjective experience of the world that we assume that other people have and that we have. that's a product of a community. Because if the gut bacteria change inside your gut, you become either happier or sadder depending on what's happening with the microbes interacting with human nerve cells. And so human consciousness is also a product of networked interaction, not of the individual. So we belong in that microbiological sense, but we also belong in an ecological sense. Every breath of air that we take, the oxygen comes part from algae and part from trees. Every bite of food that we take connects us to the living soil, sometimes the killed-off soil of our world, and to the rainfall and the biodiversity of animals and plants that are sustaining us in every moment of our lives. But we also belong in a Darwinian sense, that when I look at this leaf, I know that if I go back 2 billion years, there was a cell that divided, and some of the daughter cells became us, humans, and some became plants. So this is not just a tree. This is my cousin, my brother and sister. I'm blood kin to the trees. I'm blood kin to the birds and the living rivers and the microbes out in the ocean. So this reframes environmental ethics a little bit, I think, because it's not just a question, how should we act in relation to some separate nature? It's how do we be good members of this family? How can we be good members of this ecological community? And so that's what I mean by belonging being at multiple levels. You can think of it about the microbes on your skin and also the genealogical connections that unite us all. Now, they don't unite us in a big love fest. Biology is all about the tension between cooperation and conflict that's happening all the time. Half of the animals in the world are parasites on other animals. But all that conflict and cooperation happens in the context of communities that belong together, not as separate. And we have religious traditions that have told us that we are just wayfaring strangers traveling through this world and that we're destined for somewhere else. We don't really belong here on this fallen, broken earth. And then we have environmental groups that say, well, there are just too many humans and we've become so technological that we don't belong here either. And I'm trying to find that ground that says, no, we really do belong. And the question for us is how to have right livelihood, how to live well in a situation where we belong. And that involves enjoying and listening to the other beings that we're here with.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad by inviting you to the conference we were able to reconnect you with your cousin. It's
okay,
great.
Very good, thanks.
We'll have to take a family snap later on with you. Now, David, when it comes to, we're all from nature, and sadly, a lot of us lose that connection through our lives. And some of us, fortunately, are able to reconnect to it. For me, the reconnection happened when I started growing my vegetables on my balcony on the 13th floor of my apartment block in Sydney. And I had this epiphany moment. And I want to hear about what yours was, or maybe you've always been intrinsically connected. When I have this 2-metre high potted curry leaf tree on my balcony, and I was racing out to the office that morning. It was cold, I got my umbrella, my cardigan, went into a horrible office, fluoro lights, air conditioning, exhausted by my day, rushed to a supermarket to get food, rushed home to prepare my food, and then collapsed, sat out on my balcony, exhausted from my day. And I saw my curry leaf tree sitting there in the pot. It had been there all day. It had nourished itself. It had protected itself from attacks and pests attacks. It had stayed out in the sunlight and the beautiful oxygenated air. And it looked pretty happy. And here I was exhausted, thinking I was superior to a plant, to a tree. But looking at the tree, this tree had it sorted. This tree said, hey, I got everything I needed. I didn't have to race around and exhaust myself. And for me, that was an epiphany moment when I realised, in a lot of ways, plants, trees are superior to us. Did you have an epiphany like that? Or given your science parents that you had, were you always connected to nature?
Before I talk about my epiphanies, could I just say a couple of words about that? And that beautiful story that you shared was, to me, I heard reciprocity. That you were giving life to the curry leaf tree by caring for it and watering and making sure its soil is there and so forth. So you were devoting some of your efforts to caring for the tree. that then nourishes you, I mean, both directly, because you can use some of its leaves in cooking and so forth, but also that tree in the moment, I mean, not in the conscious way that we humans would think about it, but was reaching out to you to say, come into my time space, come into my way of being here, and it sounds like you, through the tree, were able to sort of calm down, and for many of us, that's the experience of being with other species, particularly trees. And we heard in Veronica's beautiful reading that some of the examples of how trees have been symbols of wisdom and of depth in cultures around the world, and that's available to all of us, whether it's on our balconies or out on the city street or by taking some time to go out into the forest. And that's how the tree is in the forest too. It's not a person tending the tree, but it's its relationships with the fungi and the bacteria and the birds. This reciprocity of the tree giving and being taken from, and back and forth, and forests have been doing this for hundreds of millions of years, and so have gotten that art of reciprocity down. And humans have been part of the story, but as you say, sometimes we forget that it's not that that we're no longer connected to nature, we've forgotten that we are. So the awareness of it, and every time we breathe, we're connected to other species, and we can have those reminders. And I think one of the beautiful things about your work is that you're offering that invitation to people, whether in the city or the country, to say, through growing food, you can have this source, you can have amazing food, a beautiful aesthetic experience, but also connect into some of these processes. I mean, there's nothing like having your hands in the soil or seeing a seed germinate or caring for a tree to draw us out of ourselves into those relationships that give us life. And there's, I mean, whether we're adults or kids, I mean, I think it's particularly important for kids to have at least some of that experience so they can come back to it as adults. That experience of gardening, for me, too, as a kid, I wasn't out in the forest much. There wasn't much forest where I grew up, but I had my hands in the soil growing vegetables.
Right.
And so I really do deeply feel the importance of that practice that is often delightful, but it's also full of heartbreak sometimes because the seed doesn't germinate or we forget to water the plant and it dies and so forth. And that is a profound lesson in ecology, is that without these plants, we cannot eat. And in a garden, for most of us who are lucky enough to live in a place with a supermarket down the road or so on, the fact that the garden didn't succeed doesn't mean that we will not eat at all, but we do feel that in our body, that here is a loss because of a breakage there. So, I mean, I would say that gardening has been, particularly growing food, has been an important part of what has drawn me and my imagination into the lives of plants.
So has it always been a continuous love affair with you, this connection to nature?
No, I think it's more of a slow burn epiphany.
Right.
So I do remember a particular late winter afternoon walking near a lake and wondering, should I continue working as I had been for 20 or more years as a scientist, writing grants, writing scientific papers, studying the conservation of forests, doing work that hopefully had some value to it. But I really also had a sense that I wanted to open my imagination and my body, my senses, my emotions to forests in a different way. And on that walk, I decided I'm going to take a year and find a little flat rock out in the woods, flat enough to sit on it with a reasonable degree of comfort, and study the 1 square meter of forest in front of me. And by study, I mean just keep showing up without any instruments or anything to measure stuff, just with a notebook, to return again and again to that one patch of forest. And through that year, what I mean by the slow burn is there were particular moments that were kind of fun and interesting, but really the layers were gradually peeled back to connect me into that spot. In the same way that a human friendship, often there's a spark and so on at the beginning, but true deep human friendship comes from repeatedly just being there for someone over months and years, maybe decades, in very long-standing friendships. And each particular interaction is not necessarily particularly remarkable, but through those layers of interaction and of being in relationship to another person, we come to understand their many complexities. There's always a part of them that remains a mystery to us, of course, The
So in
same
a way,
is true for place.
we did a similar thing. We chose a small patch. I chose a balcony, you chose your square metre of soil, and we were present in it, and we watched it. We watched the small grow large, the invisible become visible. Very similar ways of connection.
Yes, although you got better food out of it. Yes. So most of the plants growing, the forest that I studied was in Tennessee. Most of the plants growing are very poisonous,
Right.
because they're defending themselves from slugs and insects chewing on them and so on. And a few of those poisons have become medicines when we take them at a very low dose. And I had a powerful experience of having heart arrhythmias and winding up in the hospital. I mean, I had the arrhythmias when I was out there in the woods. And the drug they gave me in the hospital came from the forest.
Right.
So I was in this place where all sign of plants and other non-human animals had been erased, right? The hospital, white, and then the little pill bottles, the pills are white, and it all looks like it just came out of a chemistry lab, out of the human mind alone. But in fact, at least half of the drugs that we take to heal ourselves and to maintain our well-being come from fungi and plants and animals.
Yeah.
And I wish we could, in our medical culture, honor that a little bit more. Is it on the prescription bottle? Yes, there's the name and the number to call the pharmacy. And here is a picture of the plant from which this was derived to remind us, oh, my well-being now depends on this other plant. And the chemists were a really important part of that. It's human ingenuity joined with biological diversity that produces these wonderful medicines.
Your connection to nature is just so wonderful and so joyous. I'd like to know, have you ever thought about what would happen to you if you couldn't hear a bird song, if you couldn't touch a tree? What would happen?
Well, that time will come. I mean, I will lose my hearing, and we will all get to that point. Part of, well, my mind is still intact. I will have memories and so on. But I do think it's for me, when I cannot be in relation to other beings, to non-human beings, I feel myself starting to contract and get more anxious and turn inward into the thoughts of myself. And of course, we're all worried about the future and so on. But if I can walk on the city street, and it does not have to be going out into some magnificent wilderness area, and this is why I think planning in cities to incorporate parks and trees is so important. Just to spend a few moments Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, called this process unselfing. Getting into an experience of the other that draws us out through our sense of beauty into this other being. And that there's a liberation in that because some of the weight is lifted off. And we also come to realize, too, that that otherness is in fact partly an illusion, that the tree is actually part of me. So in connecting with the tree, I'm paradoxically also connecting to part of myself because my body and mind are partly made from those trees. All the books I've read were printed on trees. So it's an indirect approach. But human culture and livelihood absolutely depends on our relationship to forests. So when we feel that ease of just, oh, it's nice and shady and cool under this tree, and there's a cute little young bird being fed by its parent, and all those little delights of connecting with other species on city streets or out in parks or in forests, national parks, those are reminders of our own nature. As by drawing us out of the self, we come to understand ourselves a little better.
You also talk about the cross-species friendships that you've developed with various organisms. How do these friendships work? I mean, how would your friendship to a tree actually work?
Well, I do most of the talking and they just listen. Best kind of friendship. No, well, of course, there's an analogy, but it's not strictly. In a human, we imagine that we can understand what the other person is saying. And when we're speaking the same language, mostly we do. But there are multiple layers of misunderstanding, and even when we're talking to someone we know very well. When we are listening to the language of birds or the voices of trees, there's much bigger gaps. So we need to approach that process with a certain humility to say, I may think that I'm hearing a particular story here, but I need to remember this is all contingent on my my abilities here. And that's why I think repeated attention to a particular tree or a particular place is so important. I change in relation to the place, and I discover new things. Now, in standard Western science, we would say that I'm being the observer here. But I think there's another way of looking at it, is that the tree is also coming to know me. Not in the sense that the tree has a knotted up brain that understands me. A tree's intelligence is much more diffuse. But as I'm there, I'm leaving some of my bacteria. I'm exhaling. So in a direct physical sense, I become part of the tree. And some of my interaction with that tree in a physiological sense becomes part of how it understands its environment. I've been sitting on its roots here. Maybe I spilled some water next to it and nourished nourished the roots that were over here. So in that very, it's parallel universe that trees live in, with their decision-making and their memories and their intelligence, not present in the nervous system, but present in every cell of their body, connected with all the other cells out in, particularly in the soil. There's a quality there that I think can come to know its place. And in fact, it's quite possible that the trees know their places much better than we do, because to succeed as a tree, you're going to send your root down here, and you do not have the option of moving. You either come to know your community and get on well with your community and understand the soil and the minerals and the rainfall, or you cease to exist in that place. So trees are the great networkers, but they're also the great belongers. And so when humans are repeatedly attending to a tree, the tree comes to know them in a way that sometimes manifests in very obvious physical ways, olive farmers pruning their trees and so on, and the tree takes on the form of that has been an interaction between the tree and its caretakers. And then other times it's much more invisible. It's in the microbial physiological realm.
Now, they say we will not save what we do not love. Do you think that's part of the reason we are struggling so much at the moment with the current climate crisis and not being able to get across how to resolve it?
I do think that our separation from the voices of the living earth is part of the problem. If we imagine ourselves to be kin and cousins to other beings, and that these trees, plants, oceans are not just objects out there for us to use, but are in fact part of our family and part of our neighborhood and community, it's a lot harder to abuse them in ways that are improvident, both for our own well-being and, of course, for theirs. So the practice of paying attention to the marvels of other species in the everyday, I think, should be part of how we move forward as we deal with the climate crisis. Not only does it remind us of our own belonging, but it also informs us about the nature of the world that we're trying to save. So we talked about epiphanies. One of my epiphanies was a negative epiphany. Sitting at a corporate boardroom 30 floors up in New York City with members of one of the biggest timber corporations in the world, and also representatives of one of the biggest environmental groups in the world, and their lawyers and their accountants and so on, deciding the fate of tens of thousands of forests in the southeast of the United States. And in that room, there were about 30 people. Maybe 3 of them had spent more than 1 hour in the forests, whose fate they were deciding at that corporate boardroom table. And this was true of the environmental group as it was of the timber corporation. There's often a narrative that we demonize the people who are providing the wood for us, and sort of sanctify and honor the people who say, well, we shouldn't be doing any logging. In this case, nobody had listened to the forest, or few people had listened. So what would it be as if in the practice of private industry and of government and of nonprofits that we not stopped writing white papers and scientific papers and sitting under fluorescent lights in rooms thrashing ideas out. We need to do that, but include, say, just 6 hours a month. If you're going to be making decisions about forests, you need to be in the forest talking to people who actually live in that forest community And by people, I mean both the human people there and the trees and the birds and so on, not because that will provide an easy answer, but because it will expose you to some of the complexities of the ecosystem that you're dealing with. And the same, of course, is true for regulators of power plants or how we treat the oceans. People who are in deep lived relationship with a place are much less likely to abuse it for short-term gain and more likely to ask the difficult question of how do I live well within this? And for forests, I do think that logging and that using wood well has to be part of the answer. We need places set aside, special places, national parks, where we're not doing logging. But we also need places where we live well within the forest. So sustain the local native wildlife and meet some of our needs. Because wood is one of the most sustainable building products known, much more sustainable than steel and concrete. And it's a self-renewing ecosystem. Life has that quality of wanting to regenerate. But the mode we're in now, particularly in North America, is we have a few places we set aside as national parks. That means everything else can be trashed. And that there's some of that happening here in Australia. There's some of it happening in every continent around the world, places where land is just being cleared with no regard to the long-term vitality of the ecosystem. So the simple act of just paying attention to the voices of the creatures in our neighborhoods can in fact be revolutionary, as it grounds our decision-making in a much wider network of conversations that include other beings. It's not just about people and bringing in the experts to solve the problem.
So can you imagine President Trump visiting your sabo tree in the Ecuadorian rainforest?
I couldn't imagine it, but it would be a delightful thing to introduce him to that. I think Trump is a deeply mentally ill person and should not be in control of anything, especially not his cell phone. But there's something about being, particularly in the Sabo, the most biodiverse place that we know of in the planet, there's something that overwhelms the senses there, that you have a sense that here is an ecosystem that is hundreds of millions of years old. This is the great diversity of life manifest before me. I belong within this. I don't know anybody who's come away from that experience unmoved. Now, whether that is sufficient to get over that particular individual's self-regard and extreme destructiveness, I don't know. There'd also be a temptation to toss him off the top of the tree, solve a lot of problems. So, if that opportunity, I would be delighted to introduce him to the tree, and particularly to the voices of the people who live. I came to the Sabo tree as a visitor, but there are people, and part of what I did there was talk to people who've lived around and in that forest as individuals for many decades, but as cultures for thousands of years. And I do think that one of the pushes coming from North America now is to just keep getting the fossil fuel out of the ground, and part of that is happening in the Amazon rainforest. The recording that we heard is not too far from the outer edges of some oil fields, and so that particular area is threatened by oil extraction. One of the for people making decisions about climate change and fossil fuels, to actually talk to people whose lives and cultures have been utterly trashed by fossil fuel extraction, mostly by Chevron and other American companies back in the 70s, but continuing through the present day, to actually listen to those people's stories, to look them in the eye, and for them to say, my parents and grandparents were utterly ruined when your American company came into this place and sprayed oil all into our creeks and all over our roads to get rid of this waste, because there were no environmental restrictions on you then. And Chevron is still in court fighting the responsibility for cleaning all of that problem up. There's something about hearing people's stories there that really moves us as human beings, because most of us have some nerves that have a little bit of empathy for others. Unfortunately, some of our leaders have suppressed, chemically or otherwise, suppressed those empathy neurons to an extent where they seem atrophied.
You say that the beliefs that created this crisis will not solve the crisis. How do we develop a new system?
Well, there's one system that we can't escape, and that's the ecological system. that we all need water, and we need food, and we need to be relatively free of disease, and we need good human communities with justice within them in order to thrive. So those are the rules, the ecological, physiological, social rules of the world that are not negotiable, however much we might want to push back at them. Then within that, the question then becomes, how do we negotiate that with 8 billion people on the planet and increasing appetites and desires for more stuff? Some of those are real needs for food, and others are not real needs. They're desires for ephemera. And that there are many systems that have tried to answer that question: capitalism, socialism, and so on. What characterizes many of them, though, is that they're human ideas that have not listened very carefully to the beyond human world. So what would it mean to have a capitalist system or a socialist system or some hybrid that seriously listened to forests? So for example, trees are competing with one another for light, and yet they're also connected below ground and sharing nutrients and sharing information. So you've got both cooperation and conflict here. You've got this sort of unrestrained leap up to try and shade out other trees. That sounds very free market, social Darwinian. But you've also got the socialism of creatures sharing things below ground. And so we have multiple economic systems present within a forest. The same is true on a coral reef or in any other ecological system like a grassland. What my hope would be is that by learning more of the stories of the living world, we can understand what was it that allowed forests to thrive for 400 million years. The current system that we have now has thrived. I mean, by the current system, I mean the one that is fueled by fossil energy taken from below the ground. That started in about the 1850s. Coal in the United Kingdom maybe 100, 200 years before that. But it's a very, very short period of time. And wonderful things have come of that. But also we know that this is not an era that can last. So the living earth is telling us through fire and drought and loss of forests and loss of corals that there is a massive problem now. But the living earth can also suggest solutions. How do we live well when we're competing with others but also cooperating? How is that tension resolved? There's no one answer to that, or just unregulated capitalism or old school socialism or something. Those are impoverished ideas compared to the richness of exchanges and mutualisms and competition out in the living world. And so I'm not an economist, but my hope would be that there could be more conversations mediated perhaps by time in the outdoors, in forests. It's harder to remain in an abstracted, only intellectual space when you're surrounded by the sounds of birds and the little possum scurries across the path. And here's this fascinating tree that seems really ancient, but in fact is only 100 years old because it grows so fast next to another one that is truly ancient. It's only this thick, but it's 400 years old. All of those stories are a food for human imagination. And one of the things that has opened up for me, and having published some books, is being able to sit down with business leaders who have questions about how do I run my organization, what's the most sustainable way forward, and to be able to share with them, here's what I understand about a forest or a coral reef, not that your company has to be like a forest, but here are some ideas from 3.5 billion years of complex biological interaction. Maybe you want to listen to some of them to get some cool ideas for your own work, to allow people to work together better and to work better within the community of life. And so that's usually a wonderful discussion because the forest offers so many ideas and so many portals for human imagination.
Now, unfortunately, we're running out of time. There's one more question I want to ask you, but we're then going to open the floor to questions. So if there are any questions that anyone has for David, we have 2 microphones there that we'll be opening up shortly. Before we go to that, David, I just want to finish by saying, if an ancient tree, like, say, your sabo tree, could speak to us, and if we were prepared to listen, what do you think it would tell us about our future?
Well, the ceibo tree creates the conditions for its own success by drawing other beings into its branches. So I think the ceibo wood tree say it's up to you guys to figure out to figure out what the nature of your future will be. But as a ceibo tree, here's what I might advise. From what I have learned in this forest is you cannot do it alone. That the dogma of separation and of walls and of barriers, sometimes those are necessary. You want to keep some of those pathogenic fungi away from you, but mostly you will thrive when you can find productive interconnections. And why is that? It's because the nature of life, right back to the very origin of life, was about interconnection and dialogue, mostly chemical dialogues among the first very primitive cells. That the stuff of life is relationship and interconnection. If we can find our way into that and thinking in that way, we have a much better chance of thriving than of separating ourselves from others. That is the message of the ceibo tree. It's also the message of the trees that are right here in the city, that they thrive best when they have some of those fungi that they can work with below ground, when they have human partners that are looking after them. There's a remarkable study from New York City where they showed that when a tree is planted on a street by an anonymous municipal worker, you come back 10 years later, that tree has a 50-50 chance of still being alive, because it's a really tough thing to be a tree in New York City, right? People chain their bikes to you, there are lots of dogs pooping there, it's just a bad scene for a tree.
Tough.
But if that tree is planted with help from people in the local community, and there's a little tag on the tree saying, "Hi, I'm your new plane tree. If it's really dry, please give me a little water. Don't let your dog poop here." That tree's probability of survival goes up to nearly 100% over 10 years. Why? Because it's been given membership in the human social network. The people in the neighborhood are in relationship to the tree and give it life, not in an abstract or metaphorical way, but in a very literal way. That's the message of a tree on the street corner and of the ceibo tree in the Amazon.
Fabulous. David, thank you so much. It's been
you.
an absolute pleasure to
Thank
talk to
you.
you.
It's been
Thank you for the
a pleasure
joy
to
of
meet
it.
you.
Absolutely lovely.